So let's transition to talking about research and the use of evidence in both history and English investigation. And I'd like to start with one of the topics that was in the chapter in Crosscurrents on testimony, which is the primary sources, generally we would call it in history, documents. Any different number of documents, data sources, passages from people during that time period, could be images as well. And so I wanted to ask you, Steve, as an English teacher, what would be the way you would approach the question of testimony, and then I'll respond from the perspective of history.
Well, I think what you're talking about is the use of primary documents. And when we think about sources that are going to help inform our argument, I think a lot of times our inclination is to look for secondary sources, because that way the thinking is done for us. If I'm given a primary source, I'm obliged to interpret that on my own. And it really is important for me to know how to read that source. When I read that source, particularly if I'm reading it rhetorically or historically, I have to understand things like the context or the circumstance. I have to pay attention to who the speaker is, the audience, and maybe what led to that particular moment or that occasion. So I do think that the role of primary sources presents a unique challenge. I'm always struck as an English teacher when my students would say, I want to change my research topic. And I would say, why is that? And they'd say, because I can't find anything on my topic. I have this great question, but I can't find anything on my topic. And what that's code for is they can't find something that's already been discussed about their topic. They can find plenty of primary sources. And so a part of it is reluctance to use that interpretation. So I like to say this is where research actually begins, when you cannot find something on the original question that you've asked.
Right. In some historical topics, it would be very difficult to find a topic where nothing has been written about it before. And that would be the kind of question that maybe a graduate student would try to carve out a new path. And I wanted to go back to the question of the witchcraft idea. So this is one of those topics in history that almost every student will come into it with a huge set of preconceptions about what witchcraft is, how it occurred. And I think investigating the actual voices of the time period, but also having that being informed by some secondary sources, as you mentioned, preferably ones that had some competing interpretations, would allow them to appreciate the circumstance of the time period. So to really understand this really complex phenomenon of this huge rise in witchcraft accusations between about 1580 and 1680, you would have to understand features of society like the increase in religious passions, the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, changing weather patterns, crop failures, famines, new ideas of causation like the scientific revolution, which we appreciate today, but at the time destabilized an old intellectual tradition. And to piece all that together, come up with an interpretation of causation and change in continuity over time, I think is the task of the history writer or researcher.
Well, let's take that a little bit step farther. So the students, when they come under your watch, may likely have read The Crucible by Arthur Miller, and they would have studied perhaps The Scarlet Letter, and texts that have done a lot to promote this image of what a witch was. And then we give them a source, as we have provided in Chapter 5, where a majority of the witches in Russia were male, not female.
Right.
And suddenly students are confronted with evidence that contradicts their preconception. I don't know about you, Chris, but in my experience, a lot of times students will just simply ignore that evidence and exclude that which would perhaps influence their interpretation. But I can understand, too, to be fair to students, why it's difficult to negotiate evidence that doesn't agree with your preconceived ideas. And I think the challenge, as you said, is to how do we get them to consider the other factors that influence, in this case, why men were accused of witchcraft more often in Russia.
Right, and so I think instead of seeing that as a problem, teaching students to see it as an opportunity, evidence that doesn't fit the thesis that you have gravitated toward based on your initial foray into the research process, is to look at it as a chance to introduce some complexity. So this certainly is a feature on at least the history writing assignments, the constructed responses, the LEQ and the DBQ. The students are encouraged, because if you have 7 documents in a document-based question, not all of them are going to have the same thing. That would be a very boring DBQ. So rather than ignore or try to pigeonhole that evidence into one narrow path of interpretation, is to look at it as a conversation. Right. So in the text, Crosscurrents, what we tried to do is show students how you can make some of those moves to introduce complexity where your dominant narrative or interpretation is countered by another piece of evidence.
Right, right.
And I assume that's also what you do in English when you're writing some of the, is it the synthesis essay?
That's right. That's exactly right. And we see the same thing. Can we find that level of nuance, that ability to respond to competing perspectives? You know, it reminds me of in recent years, I would share with my students Lincoln's rhetoric, particularly during the early part of his political career, when he's engaging with Stephen Douglas in his debates, and he has some language that is overtly racist. And I asked students, does this influence your interpretation of Abraham Lincoln? And most of them say no. You know, he's still on this pedestal, and they're not going to allow that image to be shaken. And it is a tough sell because, let's face it, Abraham Lincoln gets a lot of positive press in English and history classes. And not to say that we have to tear down Lincoln like we hear in some of these presentist arguments. It's not that, but you know how we come to understand Lincoln as a more complicated person and how he's a product of his times. And I find that to be part of the discussion about teaching complexity.
Right, and that's a great example because it really draws our attention back to circumstance, which, you know, historical thinking skill that ties in with that would be contextualization. So even just in a time span of, you could take the Civil War and just cut out a time slice between, let's say, the beginning of 1862 and like the end of 1862, a huge amount of negative press has occurred. There's failures on the battlefield, and to just chart through Lincoln's speeches and writings and conversations the evolution of his ideas about introducing the idea of emancipation. So I think it takes a huge amount of attention to sensitivity to context of what's going on in the battlefield, what's going on in Lincoln's mind, what's going on with Northern public opinion, what is the South doing in response to this potential idea of emancipation, to really have a better understanding. And I think it gives students appreciation without necessarily suspending their judgment about how his ideas today, at least in his speeches during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, wouldn't fit with our ideas of racial equality.
Right. I think what you're also addressing is one of Aristotle's common topics, which is comparison. You know, in this case, maybe comparing Lincoln in the 1850s to Lincoln in the early 1860s. It might be a nice opportunity to see how there's continuity or change over time. And one of Aristotle's common topics is comparison.